Good evening, and welcome back. Pull your chair a little closer, will you? It's that kind of night, the kind where the wind has opinions, and the dark outside the window feels less like absence and more like presence. If you're listening from somewhere far away, we want to know. Drop it in the chat, light a candle, pour something warm. We're glad you're here. Tonight, we go back. Further back than last week. Further back than the stories your grandparents told their grandparents. Back to a time when the sky had not yet decided what it wanted to be. When the sea was younger than grief, and the mountains were still learning how to hold their own weight. Tonight we tell the story of Athena, not just her birth, not just the famous battles and the famous city, and the famous spider girl who wove herself into a cautionary tale. All of it, the whole inheritance. Some of you already know pieces. Everyone knows pieces. That's the thing about myths. They don't arrive whole. They come to you in fragments, overheard conversations, a vase in a museum you didn't mean to linger beside, a line in a poem you half remember. Tonight, we will put the fragments together, or we'll try, and where they don't fit cleanly, where the edges of one version scrape against another, we'll say so. That's part of the story too. So, in the beginning, before Athena, before the grey eyes that saw everything at once, before the owl perched on the olive branch and the spear that was never meant for idle hands, there was chaos. Not chaos the way we use it now, the word we throw at traffic and elections, an inbox overflow. The Greeks meant something older and stranger by it, something that does not translate cleanly. Chaos was not disorder. Chaos was the yawning, the gaping, the open mouth before the first word. It was not nothing. Nothing is too simple. It was the potential for everything compressed into a state of absolute unresolvedness. Some philosophers would later call it the void. Some would call it the deep. What it actually was a beforeness, the condition that exists prior to existence. From chaos came Gaia, the earth, not a metaphor, not yet a metaphor anyway, but a being of such enormous, grinding, patient power that the mountains she grew on her back were not constructed but secreted, the way a living thing secretes bone. Gaia was the first real thing, the first thing with a shape that held. And she was alone in a way that the word alone barely begins to describe, because to be alone, you need to know that something else exists somewhere, and she was the only context there was. She made Uranos, the sky. She made him herself, which is to say, she did not require another party, which is to say, she prefigured something the mythology later spent enormous energy trying to suppress. That generative power does not always need a counterpart. She made the sky so she would have something to look up at. There is something in that detail that I have never been able to leave alone, that the first act of the first real being was to create something to look toward, something beyond herself, whether that was longing or ambition, or simply a structural need for something above. The myths don't say. Maybe there's no difference. Uranos was beautiful in the way that open sky is always beautiful, which is to say relentlessly, without interruption, in a way that begins to feel oppressive if you stare too long. He covered Gaia. He pressed down on her. The old myths are unambiguous about this, about the weight of sky on earth. And from that pressure, those first unions, came the first children. There were Titans, 12 of them, in the most common accounting. Oceanus and Tethys, who became the world river and its consort, Hyperion and Thea, who carried light, Caius and Phoebe, who carried intellect, Cronus and Rhea, Mnemosyne, who was memory itself, Themis, who was order, Iapetus, who was, the myths are less certain here, the piercer, some say, an older function that got obscured by later revisions. And there were others, the Cyclopes, one-eyed giants of enormous craft, the Hecatonchires, creatures of 100 hands and 50 heads, so terrible that even the Titans looked away. Uranos looked at his children and felt something. The myths call it fear. It might have been shame. Whatever it was, it made him push them back into Gaia, back into the darkness before form, as if he could undo the generative act by simply refusing to acknowledge its products. He imprisoned his monstrous children in Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, before there was an underworld to put them in. The pit made itself around them, the way a wound makes itself around something foreign. And Gaia felt this. She felt their weight. She felt their voices. She went to her children, those she still had access to, and asked them, "Who will help me?" She held a sickle. She had made the sickle herself from grey flint, from her own substance, from the kind of anger that converts itself into tool rather than cry, because crying changes nothing. Who will help me? The Titans did not answer. One by one, they found reasons to look elsewhere, reasons that the myths diplomatically do not specify, all except Cronus, the youngest. He took the flint sickle from his mother's hands, and he waited, hidden, for his father to come near. When Uranos lay down across the earth at night, this was before anyone had invented the idea that sky and earth should be separate, distinct, non-touching. Cronus reached out in the dark and he cut. He severed the genitals of the sky. He threw them into the sea. From the blood that fell on Gaia sprang the Furies, the Erinyes, those relentless hunters of crimes against kinship. As if the cosmos understood, in that original act of violence, that something had been set in motion that would not stop pursuing its own consequences. From the sea foam where flesh met water rose Aphrodite, which is a story for another night, though it is worth pausing on the fact that desire was born from a wound. Uranos withdrew. The sky lifted. The earth and sky separated, and between them came the air, and into the air came light, and with light came the world, as a place where things could be seen and known and named. Cronus had done what no one else would do. He had unmade his father. He would spend the rest of his reign becoming him. There is a kind of trap built into the act of overthrowing a tyrant by becoming capable of greater tyranny, and the trap is that you don't see it closing. Cronus ruled the cosmos now. The Titans settled into their various dominions, the oceans, the rivers, the bright passages of the sun, the slow turning of the stars. And Cronus took Rhea as his consort and waited for children. He had been warned. The warning came from Gaia, the same source his power had come from, which should have told him something about the nature of gifts and the strings they carry. The warning said, "One of your children will overthrow you, the way you overthrew your father." Cronus heard this and made what he considered the obvious calculation. He ate them, not metaphorically, not in some symbolic sense of holding them back, denying their growth, crushing their potential, though he did all of that too. He ate them, physically, one after another, as Rhea brought them to him. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, 5 children swallowed whole, alive, kept alive in the darkness of their father's belly, because gods do not die the way mortal things die, because something in them persisted through even that consumption, preserved in the dark and waiting. Rhea's grief was the kind that doesn't announce itself. She did not rage. She did not weep where anyone could see. She went to her mother, to Gaia, and to the ancient prophecies that lived in the deep stone of Crete, and she asked, "What can be done?" What was done was this. When her 6th child was ready to be born, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes. She gave Cronus the stone. He swallowed it without looking, because the powerful rarely look closely at what they consume, because they've grown accustomed to things coming to them and going down without resistance. And the real child, Zeus, the last, the hidden one, was spirited to Crete, to a cave on Mount Ida, where he was raised by nymphs and a divine goat named Amalthea, who gave him milk from her own body, who fed him on honey and wild magic, who would later break one of her own horns on a tree. And from that breaking came the cornucopia, plenty out of damage, abundance from the sight of a wound. The world that Cronus had built was not monstrous, exactly. The Titans were not evil in any simple sense. They had their orders, their dignities, their slow celestial rotations. Hyperion drove the light across the sky with terrible consistency. Oceanus wrapped the world in his patient current. Prometheus and Epimetheus worked at their own projects, which we will come to. The problem with the age of Cronus was not cruelty, but stasis. Not suffering, but a kind of managed suffocation. The future held back, so the present could endure indefinitely. This cannot hold. The myths know this. Every mythology knows this. Stasis is not stability. It is only the pressure of the not yet released building. Zeus grew in the cave. He grew fast, the way divine things grow when they have something to grow toward. Gaia fed him. The nymphs Adrasteia and Io danced and clashed their weapons to drown out the sound of his crying. So Cronus, circling, would not hear a child where there should be no child. He grew and was trained and was given by Gaia, always by Gaia, who is always the origin and always the turning point, a draught to put in his father's cup. Cronus drank it. The stone came up first, retched out and rolling onto the earth, where it would later be planted at Delphi as the omphalos, the navel of the world, the center from which everything calculated its distance. Then came his siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, each one surfacing into light after years in the dark, blinking, angry, ready. The war they called the Titanomachy took 10 years. 10 years of sky and earth shaking, of mountains used as weapons, of seas thrown aside like cloth. The Titans were vast and old and powerful in the way that old things are powerful. Deep-rooted, resistant, almost geological in their endurance. But Zeus had two things they didn't. The Cyclopes, freed from Tartarus as payment for their support, who forged for him the thunderbolt, and the Hecatonchires, the 100-handed ones, who could throw 100 boulders at once, who could storm a fortress from every direction simultaneously. I want to dwell on the Cyclopes for a moment, because no one does, and they deserve it. They were imprisoned before the war began. They were imprisoned by Ouranos, then kept imprisoned by Cronus, a 100-handed generation of craftsmen trapped in darkness because two consecutive rulers were afraid of them. What they made when they were finally freed was the most precise instrument in cosmic history. A bolt of lightning engineered for a specific hand, a specific purpose, calibrated to end a specific war. They had presumably been thinking about it for a very long time. The Titans fell. Most were sent to Tartarus, the deep place, the original imprisonment now repurposed as permanent consequence. Atlas was given a different sentence: to hold the sky on his shoulders forever, to bear what no one should have to bear, to be the living reminder that some debts don't get discharged. Prometheus escaped the general condemnation for reasons the myths attribute to wisdom, to foresight. His name means forethought, which is significant, and he would remain outside Tartarus, working, observing, coming to his own conclusions about what the new order owed to those it hadn't remembered to include. But the war was over. The sky and earth stayed separated. The cosmos exhaled. Now came the question of what to do with everything. The three brothers who had survived Cronus's belly, Zeus, Hades, Poseidon, stood before everything and divided it. They drew lots, which is either a model of fairness or the most sophisticated way the powerful have ever devised to call their predetermined preferences the will of chance. Zeus got the sky, Poseidon got the sea, Hades got the underworld. The earth, Gaia herself, the first principle, the one who had made all of this possible, was declared shared, neutral ground, belonging to none of them exclusively, which meant belonging to all of them equally, which in practice meant it became the place where their competing interests would fight it out for eternity. Hestia was given the hearth, or she chose it. The myths are divided, and I find I prefer the version where she chose it, where she looked at everything available to her and said, I want the fire at the center of the house. I want the thing that makes shelter, not the sky or the sea or the underworld's vast bureaucracy of souls. The hearth. She took herself out of the inheritance dispute and into the only role that cannot be taken away, because without it, nothing else functions. Hera became Zeus's wife. This is usually presented as a love story, or at least an alliance story, and sometimes it is. But it is also, if you read carefully, a coercion story, a story about power and what it does to the choices available to those adjacent to it. Hera was magnificent and terrible in her pride, and we will return to her because she crosses Athena's story at several critical junctions, and the crossings are not gentle. the Olympians established themselves, 12 of them, in the most common accounting, though the number shifts depending on who's telling it and which Olympians they needed for the story at hand. They built what the myths call the divine order, the cosmos as governed thing, the arrangement of principles that would persist. Each had domains: Apollo the sun and music and prophecy, Artemis the moon and the hunt and wild things, Ares the violence of war, Aphrodite desire, Hephaestus the forge, Hermes the roads and the messages between, Demeter the grain and the green growing things. The world's functions were distributed, named, given divine accountability. And then, Metis, the story of what happened with Metis, is the story that produces Athena. And to understand Athena, you have to understand her mother. And to understand her mother, you have to understand what the word Metis actually meant to the Greeks. Not just wisdom in the abstract, not just intelligence, but a specific kind of wisdom, practical, adaptive, cunning in the best sense, the intelligence of the craftsman and the strategist, the ability to read a situation and respond precisely to what it is rather than to what you expected it to be. Metis was Titaness of this quality. She was, in some versions, the first wife of Zeus. She was the one who had given him the draft that made Cronus regurgitate his children. She had been, in practical terms, essential to the war's outcome. And Zeus, who had been warned, who was always warned, who inherited from his father and grandfather a relationship to prophecy that was mostly characterized by trying to outrun it. Zeus had been told that Metis would bear first a daughter of surpassing power, then a son who would overthrow his father, and we have seen what happens when fathers hear this particular prophecy. And Zeus, despite everything, despite his own origin story being precisely a refutation of this strategy, did what Cronus had done. He swallowed her. Not a stone this time. Metis herself, already pregnant, already carrying the daughter within her. He swallowed the goddess of wisdom and contained her, and within him she continued her work. Because that is the nature of that kind of intelligence, it does not stop. And within him she began to make, to craft. Some say she forged armor. Some say she made a robe. Some say she simply spoke, and her speaking was enough to build. Inside Zeus, Metis prepared her daughter. What happened next depends enormously on who's telling it. In the oldest versions, Zeus simply split open, and Athena emerged fully formed. In later versions, Hephaestus struck Zeus on the head with an axe, asked to, or acting on his own initiative. The accounts differ, and through the cleft came Athena, already armored, already armed, already shouting the war cry, and the sound of it made the sky ring and the sea churn, and even the gods of Olympus stood back. In some accounts, it was Prometheus who wielded the axe. In some, it was both, over different versions of the myth, which is how myths work. They absorb the contradictions rather than resolving them, because the contradictions are usually where the real meaning lives. She came out shouting. She came out in armor. She came out with grey eyes already opened, already seeing. This is the birth the myths dwell on. Not the 9 months in darkness, not the years of careful preparation, not Metis working in silence at the forge of the divine belly, but the moment of emergence, the explosion of it, the way the sea pulled back and the sky went white, and the fully realized goddess stood on the threshold of Olympus before anyone had gotten used to the idea of her. She was Athena, daughter of Zeus and Metis, born from wisdom and power in an act that tried to be an ending and became instead the most precise possible beginning. Some say she was always Zeus's favorite. He gave her his aegis, that terrible divine shield that could spread panic through armies, which no other god was permitted to carry. He gave her access to his thunderbolts, a privilege extended to no one else. He trusted her with the things he trusted no one with. Whether this was love or gratitude or simply recognition of what she was, what she had been prepared to be inside her mother, the myths don't pass too carefully. Perhaps Zeus didn't either. She was goddess of wisdom, yes, of craft, of the specific intelligence that allows a thing to be made well. She was goddess of strategy, of the planning that precedes the violence and determines its outcome. She was patron of cities, which is to say patron of the human project of organized living together. All the friction and negotiation and compromise that implies. She was a goddess of war, but not the war of Ares, who loved the wet metal smell of battle for its own sake, who was indifferent to cause and consequence as long as there was blood. Athena's war was the one that had a reason, the one with a plan behind it, an objective beyond the immediate sensation of conflict. She remained a virgin. The myths are very deliberate about this, and scholars have argued for centuries about what it means, about whether it signifies purity in the religious sense, or independence in the political sense, or simply the recognition that a certain kind of power is incompatible with the vulnerability that comes from being wanted. The three virgin goddesses, Athena, Artemis, Hestia, each chose or were given their independence for different reasons, and in each case the choice or gift says something specific about the domain they protected. Athena's virginity feels to me less like innocence and more like sovereignty. She did not refuse desire because she was above it. She refused the situation that desire would have placed her in, the subordination, the belonging to. She was also, and this matters for everything that follows, a craftsman, not just the patron of craftsmen, not just the divine overseer of looms and forges, but actively skilled. The myths tell stories of her weaving, of her making. She made the first ship, some say. She taught the first potter. She invented the bridle that allowed Bellerophon to approach Pegasus. She was not content with the oversight of making. She participated in it. This is the goddess. Now let her move. The contest for Athens is usually told as a set piece, Athena versus Poseidon, each of them presenting a gift to an unnamed city on a rocky Attic peninsula, and the people choosing. It is a cleaner story than it actually is in the versions that clean it. The real versions are stranger and more specific and more interesting. Poseidon struck the Acropolis with his trident. The rock cracked, and from the crack came a spring. But the spring ran salt because Poseidon was the sea. and what he gave carried its own limitation with it. The salt water would not help crops grow. The salt water was beautiful and impressive, and immediately useless for the things that actual living required. Athena struck the same rock with her spear, or she bent down and placed something in the earth. The accounts differ on this. What grew was an olive tree. The olive tree provided oil, which meant light in darkness, and warmth in cold, and preservative, and medicine, and the base of cooking. It provided olives, which meant food that could be stored through winter. Its wood was dense and strong. Its roots, once established, could survive drought, fire, the kinds of catastrophe that visited the ancient world regularly and without apology. It was not impressive in the way the salt spring was impressive. It was useful. It was, in the specific way Athena was always useful, oriented toward the sustaining of life rather than the display of power. The city chose the olive tree. The city chose Athena. Poseidon's anger made the sea surrounding the peninsula rough and treacherous. There are those who say he never entirely forgave, but the city stood, and the grey-eyed goddess claimed it, and Athens became the place where the contest between display and utility, between the grand gesture and the practical gift, had been decided in favor of the latter. The Parthenon would be built later, the gold and ivory statue inside it. The city would become the thing it became, the theatre and the philosophy and the democracy and the warships and the empire and the eventual ruin of the empire and the long, slow survival of the idea of Athens long after Athens itself had ceased to be what it was. But that is a story for another day. The owl came to her later, in the later consolidations of her mythology, though the grey eyes had always been there. Clarkopis, the Greeks called her, grey-eyed or owl-eyed, the same word doing double work. The owl sees in darkness, sees completely, does not blink, flies without sound. It was a good symbol for what she was. The myths found it when they needed it. Let me collect the thread. The thread here is specific. A goddess born from an act designed to prevent her, armed and ready before she drew her first breath, operating in a cosmos ordered by power struggles and prophecies, and the desperate attempts of the powerful to sidestep consequences that turn out to be structural rather than contingent. She is not a product of the order. She is older than the final order, was prepared inside the swallowed god of wisdom. Before the Olympians had finished settling, she arrives knowing. And what she does with knowing, how she deploys it in a world populated with heroes who need it, and monsters who resist it, and mortals who insult it, and gods who misunderstand it, is the long work of the mythology. We come now to the humans. They had not existed during the Titanomachy. They would arrive in the period after, in the carefully organized world the Olympians had built, and they would arrive depending on which version of the creation myth you prefer, either as a pre-existing feature of the earth, already wandering around when the gods noticed them, or as a specific creation by one party or another. The version that involves Athena most directly involves Prometheus. Prometheus, Titan, son of Iapetus, escaped from the general condemnation of his family, possessor of genuine foresight, a figure who is impossible to get a clean read on, had been watching the new divine order take shape. He'd been watching the humans too. In some versions, he made them, shaped them from clay with water from a river in Boeotia, gave them form. In the versions where he didn't make them, he still felt something about them, a responsibility, an investment, something the myths reach for and don't quite name, a kind of solidarity, maybe, with those left out of the divine settlement. When Zeus decided that humans would offer sacrifices to the gods, would kill animals and burn the fat and grain and dedicate the act to Olympus, Prometheus arranged the first division. He took a bull, divided it into two portions. On one side, the meat and organs wrapped in the stomach. On the other, the bare bones wrapped in gleaming fat. He let Zeus choose. Zeus chose the fat. It looked better, it gleamed, it promised what it didn't contain, and so the arrangement was made, and Prometheus had introduced a structural inequality into divine mortal relations that would take a very long time to be acknowledged. But the bigger thing, the thing that brought the real consequence, was fire. He took it from the forge of Hephaestus, from heaven itself in some versions, and he brought it to the humans. Small thing, just fire. But fire meant warmth, which meant survival through winters that would otherwise kill. Fire meant cooking, which changed what could be eaten and how long it could keep. Fire meant metalwork eventually, which meant tools, which meant the whole technological cascade. Fire meant sacrifice done properly, which meant the divine transaction, the offering and the receiving. Fire was not a single gift. Fire was the precondition for everything the humans became. Zeus found out. Of course he found out. The smoke went up, and the gods could smell the difference between wood smoke and offering smoke. And Prometheus had not been subtle. The punishment was specific in its cruelty. Prometheus chained to a rock in the Caucasus, an eagle coming each day to eat his liver regenerating each night because he was divine, and divine things regenerated, and each morning the eagle returning, endlessly. The punishment was engineered to be as long as the chains were unbreakable. Athena does not appear in this story in the primary position, but she circulates around its edges. She taught the humans to use what fire made possible. She is associated with weaving, with the loom, with the technologies of domestication and craft that fire enabled. She was already there when Prometheus gave his gift, already invested in the human project, already orienting her wisdom toward the maintenance of the world that humans were in the process of building. She watched Prometheus suffer and did not intervene, could not, perhaps, or calculated that intervention would cost more than the chained Titan could be saved by. But the myths suggest she remembered. That memory is a kind of loyalty, even when it can't act. The humans who received fire lived in a world that had already been shaped by their creator's choices, and those shapes were not always benign. The myths tell of ages, the golden age when Cronus, old Cronus, the swallower, the imprisoned, somehow presided over a time of effortless abundance and perpetual springtime and perfect virtue. No need to farm. The earth gave freely. No war. There was nothing to fight over and no disposition toward fighting. People were good in the Golden Age, not because they had overcome the impulse to be otherwise, but because the conditions for otherwise didn't exist. They died eventually, but gently, slipping away in sleep, as if they'd simply become bored with their own perfection. After them came the Silver Age, and already the degradation is clear. People were slower to wisdom, took 100 years to reach maturity, and the maturity, when it came, was not as luminous as the gold. They fought among themselves. They refused to honor the gods with proper sacrifice, which the gods noticed and minded. Zeus ended them with a gesture, not with punishment exactly, but with withdrawal. He stopped supporting them, and they were not sufficient to survive without support. The Bronze Age was harder and more present, and more what we recognize. Bronze Age people loved war. The myths say they were made of bronze, which is probably poetic, but might also be literal in some internal sense. Their hardness, their inflexibility, their orientation toward collision rather than negotiation. They died in wars and went to Hades without distinction, and the underworld received them without comment. Between bronze and iron, some tellings insert the age of heroes, the one that contains the great myths, the ones we know by name, the Argonauts, the siege of Troy, the labors of Hercules, the wanderings of Odysseus. It is not a purer age than what came before, but it is a more saturated one, more colored, more itself. The heroes of this age are excessive, too strong, too proud, too desired, too fated, too capable of both great love and great atrocity. They burn through the world and leave it changed, usually in the direction of less enchanted than it was. And then the Iron Age, which is us, which the ancient Greeks believed they already lived in, which they described with a weary specificity that suggests they knew its defining characteristic from the inside: labor, strife, the necessity of working against resistance for everything you receive. Children who don't honor parents, friends who break faith, the gradual retreat of justice, of shame, of the restraining impulses that let people live together without destroying each other. Athena was active across all the ages that mattered. She did not recede. She did not. Unlike some Olympians who seem to drift in and out of concern for the mortal world, depending on their moods, absent herself. She was present and purposeful and consistently on the side of the intelligence that builds, the craft that persists, the strategy that turns toward a viable outcome rather than a satisfying one. Her greatest heroes reflect this. She did not choose the strongest. She chose the most thoughtful, which sometimes coincided with the strongest, but did not always. Perseus was the son of Zeus and Danae, and he came into the world already the subject of a prophecy that was not about him. Acrisius, his grandfather, had been warned that his daughter's son would kill him, and Acrisius had made the response you might expect from a man who had apparently learned nothing from every story in the mythology. He locked his daughter in a bronze tower, which Zeus, who had presumably mastered the art of the enclosed space during his own childhood in a Cretan cave, found no obstacle at all. There was a golden shower. There was a sun. Athena threw them into the sea in a chest. They survived, a detail that some tellings give credit for to Poseidon calming his own waters, but that others simply attribute to the stubbornness of fate. They landed on the island of Seriphos, where they were taken in by a fisherman named Dictys, whose brother Polydectes would later rule the island and want Danae in a way she did not reciprocate. Perseus grew up fast in the way that heroes grow up, not slowly accumulating wisdom, but arriving suddenly at the point where a test presents itself. Polydectes wanted Danae and found Perseus an obstacle, and the way to remove an obstacle is to send it somewhere it probably won't come back from. He sent Perseus for the head of Medusa. Medusa is a complicated figure, and the mythology has not been kind to her. In the oldest traditions, she is simply a monster, one of the Gorgons, 3 sisters with hair of snakes and faces that turn the looker to stone. In later traditions, added or recovered depending on who you believe, she was once a beautiful woman who was violated in Athena's temple, and Athena's response was to transform her into the creature she became, which is, depending on how you read it, either a story about a goddess so consumed by the violation of her sacred space that she punished the victim, or a story about the specific nature of Athena's power, which is transformative and does not make distinctions that tragedy makes in retrospect. I want to be honest. I am not certain what to do with this version of the story, and I've been turning it around for some time, and I'm putting it here because leaving it out would be a different kind of dishonesty. Athena helped Perseus. This is clear regardless of the Medusa origin story. She gave him a mirrored shield, bronze polished to a reflective surface, so he could approach the Gorgon without looking at her directly. He would see the reflection, not the face, the image, not the lethal original. Hermes also helped, providing winged sandals and the adamantine sickle and directions to the grey, those 3 grey sisters who shared one eye and one tooth among them, and who knew things that the other paths to Medusa could not reveal. Perseus stole the eye as it passed from hand to hand, held the world of those 3 ancient sisters hostage until they gave him what he needed, and he flew, borrowed wings, borrowed blade, borrowed shield, to the edge of the world where the Gorgons slept. He did not look at Medusa directly. He watched her image in the shield and cut, and the head came away, and he put it in the bag he'd been given for exactly this purpose. And from the neck of Medusa rose Pegasus and the giant Chrysaor, children of Poseidon, who'd been with her all along, waiting in that impossible body for the cut that would release them. He fled before the other Gorgons woke, their grief a sound that could be heard across the water, their pursuit dropping away because Perseus had the cap of invisibility on him, and they couldn't track what they couldn't see. He stopped in Ethiopia. There was a princess chained to a rock on the coast. Andromeda, daughter of Cepheus and Cassiopeia, offered a sacrifice to a sea monster because Cassiopeia had claimed to be more beautiful than the Nereids, and the Nereids had complained to Poseidon, and Poseidon's sea monsters didn't particularly care whether the girl was responsible for for her mother's boast. Perseus killed the monster, married Andromeda, brought her home. He brought the head of Medusa back to Seriphos and found that in his absence, Polydectes had continued his campaign against Danae. Perseus walked into the banquet hall. He did not make a speech. He drew out the head, and Polydectes and his court became the stone garden you can still ostensibly find if you know where to look on that island, though the island has been considerably rearranged since the myth was set. He gave the head to Athena. She mounted it on her aegis, the divine shield that Zeus had entrusted to her. The face of Medusa, which had turned men to stone with its direct gaze, became the decoration on the armor of the goddess of wisdom, now itself a weapon. The terrible image without its original lethal power, deployed at her discretion rather than available to anyone who looked. There is something in that transformation that feels significant, the uncontrollable danger becoming a controlled one, the monstrous power brought inside the domain of the purposeful. Perseus went home to Argos and killed his grandfather by accident with a discus at athletic games, fulfilling the prophecy by the most indirect route possible. In the way that prophecies in the Greek myths always fulfill themselves through the very attempts to avoid them, as if the trying to avoid is itself the mechanism of fulfillment. Athena moved on. Heracles, Hercules. If you prefer the Latin, and many people do, he is that large in the cultural imagination, was born to Alcmene of Thebes and Zeus, which meant he was born with Hera's hostility already arranged. Hera hated Zeus's mortal children in direct proportion to the visibility of his love for them, and with Heracles, that proportion was enormous. She sent serpents to kill him in his cradle. He was perhaps 8 months old, and he strangled them. He was, by any accounting, the strongest thing that had ever worn a mortal body. The myths try again and again to quantify it, to give it some scale, and they keep having to reach for new comparisons. He held the sky where Atlas had held it, substituting his own shoulders for the Titans, and the sky stayed up. He fought the river god Achelous and won, which is not a small thing. Rivers are old and have a permanence that muscled humans cannot match with force alone. He passed through the world like a very specific kind of disaster, targeted, motivated, overwhelming. He killed his own wife and children. This is not a footnote. This is in the myth because the myth needs it there, because the madness Hera sent him into, the violence he committed in the darkness of divine affliction, is the wound that the 12 labors are meant to address. He went to Delphi to ask what he should do, what penance was possible for what he had done, and the oracle sent him to Eurystheus, king of Tiryns, whose commands he would obey for 12 tasks. Labors. The word implies work. The word implies the specific discipline of applying enormous strength to a specific problem and doing it correctly. Athena is present throughout the labors, though her role shifts. She is not his primary divine patron. That is complicated and contested, with various gods lending support at various points, but she is consistently among those who help him, who provide what wisdom and craft can provide when strength alone is insufficient. She helped him obtain the bronze castanets that drove away the Stymphalian birds. She accepted the gift of the Stymphalian birds afterward, those creatures of Ares who had iron feathers like arrows and dung that destroyed crops, taking them to the island of Ares where they would become the problem of the Argonauts on their way to Colchis. The labours took him to the edges of the known world and past them, to the garden of the Hesperides, where the golden apples grew at the world's end, to the cattle of Geryon, three-bodied giant at the far west, past the pillars Heracles himself set as the limit of the navigable world, to the underworld itself, where he brought back Cerberus on a leash and returned him, because the task had been to capture the dog, not to keep it. He suffered enormously. This is part of what the myths insist on, that his strength was not a freedom from suffering, but an exposure to more of it, that the capacity to endure is also the capacity to be made to endure more. His second wife, Deianira, meaning well, sent him a robe, soaked him what she'd been told was a love potion. It was the blood of the centaur Nessus, whom Heracles had killed years before with an arrow dipped in the Hydra's blood. Blood that was itself the second labour's souvenir, harvested from a creature that grew 2 heads for every one cut away. The blood had gotten into the arrow. The arrow had gotten into Nessus. And Nessus, dying, had harvested his own corrupted blood and given it to Deianira with a careful lie. The robe burned. It burned through to his bones in a way that his strength could do nothing about, because strength addresses external opposition, not internal consumption. He built his own funeral pyre on Mount Oeta. He climbed onto it. He asked his companions to light it. They would not. His friend Philoctetes did, eventually, and received the great bow in payment, which bow would later turn up at Troy in circumstances that bent the entire war. The smoke went up. The gods received the body. And then, because this is Heracles, because the myth cannot do otherwise, Zeus gathered what was deathless in his son and placed it among the stars. His mortal half went to Hades. His divine portion ascended to Olympus, where Hera finally, at the end, was reconciled, and where he married Hebe, goddess of youth, and became fully divine. Athena welcomed him. That detail is in the sources, specific and brief. At the moment of his apotheosis, Athena was there. She had been moving through the mortal world all along, distributing what she had, not her power exactly, but her orientation, her angle of approach. She gave heroes not the strength to win, but the clarity to see what winning required. Odysseus was different from Perseus and Heracles, the way a specific tool is different from force. Precise where they were overwhelming, endlessly adaptive where they were relentlessly direct. He was not the strongest at Troy. He was not the bravest, not in the way that gets counted as bravery in the heat of battle. The Achilles-style bravery that is indifferent to death because it has somehow resolved the question in advance. Odysseus was afraid, regularly, visibly, specifically, afraid of the sea, afraid of the unknown shores, afraid of the gods who wanted him dead. What he had instead of fearlessness was persistence. And what he had instead of invulnerability was flexibility. And what he had most consistently, most characteristically, was Athena. She loved him. The mythology is unusually willing to say this directly. In the Odyssey, she tells him so, or near enough. She tells him that she cannot abandon him because he is so much like her, so quick of mind, so ready to turn circumstance to advantage, so oriented toward the outcome rather than the gesture. Whether this is vanity on her part, recognizing herself in a mortal vessel, or genuine affection, genuine delight in a mind that works the way hers does, the effect is the same. She was with him in ways she was with almost no one else. At Troy, Odysseus was the one who thought of the horse. Some say Athena suggested it. Some say Epius built it with her help. Some say Odysseus thought of it alone in the way clever people sometimes think of things that seem divine because no merely ordinary intelligence could have arrived there. The wooden horse was not a military strategy in any conventional sense. It was a story deployed as a weapon, a lie told in physical form, a gift that was something else, and the use of deception as force is Athena's domain as much as it is Odysseus's. The Trojans should have listened to Cassandra. The Trojans should have listened to Laocoon. They listened to neither, and they brought the horse inside, and the thing inside the horse ended them. The wandering home took 10 years. Poseidon's rage. Odysseus had blinded Poseidon's son Polyphemus, the Cyclops, which is a whole separate story of clever and brutal, made the sea an obstacle that refused to be reduced to a root. Odysseus was pushed from island to island, each one its own catastrophe. The witch goddess Circe, who turned his men to pigs, the lotus eaters, who made forgetting into a comfort so perfect it was a trap, Scylla and Charybdis, who were not metaphors but actual things with mouths, the sirens who sang at the edge of consciousness and meant the ships that went close enough to hear. Athena could not always protect him. Poseidon's claim was older and colder than her patronage, and in the divine hierarchy of the sea, there were limits to what she could counter directly. What she could do was provide wisdom in the moments when wisdom was available, disguise when concealment was necessary, a particular quality of clarity when everything was dark and the mortal mind wanted to give up. She gave him that clarity on Ithaca. He arrived home disguised, looked at his own house occupied by men eating his provisions and courting his wife, and did not announce himself. He waited, he planned, he strung a bow that no one else could string, and killed every suitor in the hall, efficiently, with the specific thoroughness of someone who has been patient for a very long time and has no patience left for hesitation. The reunion with Penelope is the thing the myths linger on in Athena's hands. She held back the dawn, lengthening the night so they had time, so the reunion wasn't rushed, so the 10-year interval could begin to be crossed. She gave them the night as a gift. She gave him back his face at the end, his actual face, his own age, the lines and the grey and the body that had crossed the sea for a decade and showed it. She gave him back to himself and to his wife and to his son and to the kingdom that had waited. That is what Athena does with the ones she loves. She gives them themselves back, clarified, after everything has tried to unmake them. I need to pause here, not because the thread is lost, but because the next part is heavy, and heavy things require a moment before you pick them up. The spider. Arachne of Lydia was a weaver. She was, by all accounts, exceptional. Exceptional enough that people came to watch her work. Exceptional enough that the praise had turned specific and categorical. She is better than Athena herself. Whether Arachne said this first, or whether the people around her said it and she didn't contradict it, the myth does not split the credit. The claim existed, the challenge existed, implicit, hanging in the air of her workshop. Athena came to her disguised as an old woman. She offered, in the way that gods in disguise always offer, a chance to walk it back, to affirm the conventional piety, to acknowledge divine precedence. Arachne did not take it. She accepted the challenge directly. She said, "Let the goddess come, and we'll see." The goddess came. They wove. Athena's tapestry depicted the gods in their glory, the founding of Athens, the contest with Poseidon, the olive tree and the salt spring, the divine order demonstrated in narrative form. Her weaving was perfect. The sources consistently say this, not in the way of diplomatic compliment, but in the way of technical assessment. Perfect. Arachne's tapestry depicted the gods in their worst moments. Every rape, every deception, every time Zeus had transformed himself into something other than a god to approach a woman who did not want a god approaching her. Every time divine power had been used against a mortal, the bull and Europa, the swan and Leda, the golden shower and Danae. It was a documentation, a record, and it too was perfect. The sources consistently say this, which is the more unsettling detail, because it means that Athena could find no flaw in the craft, only in the subject matter, only in what the craft was being used to say. Athena destroyed the tapestry. The rage was there. It's described, the grey eyes going hard, the spear weight to the hand, and then something else, some secondary emotion the myths don't name precisely, but that might have been something more complicated than simple anger. She struck Arachne with her shuttle 3 times, and Arachne, filled with shame, with whatever it is that fills a person who has been right and punished for it, hanged herself. Athena relented, transformed her, gave her back a form of life, not Arachne the woman, not the hands and the eyes and the loom, but Arachne the spider and all her children, weaving forever, high and low, in every corner, in every space where something needs to be constructed from a line. Whether this is mercy or cruelty, the myth refuses to say clearly. Whether Athena felt something in that moment that was not just anger, some recognition, perhaps, that the girl had shown her something true and suffered for it, that the perfection of the craft was real, that the testimony was accurate. The myth gestures toward, without resolving, the spider weaves. That's what the myth ends with. The weaving continues. Anyway, there was a war. Troy had been a long time building to itself. The seeds of it were planted at a wedding, specifically at the wedding of Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, which was attended by most of the Olympians, but not by Eris, the the goddess of discord, who had not been invited for the obvious reason that you don't invite discord to a wedding if you can help it. Eris arrived anyway. She threw a golden apple into the middle of the celebration, inscribed with the words, "For the fairest," and left. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite each believed the apple was theirs. Zeus, with the political intelligence of someone who has been married a very long time to a very powerful person and has several extramarital complications active simultaneously, declined to judge. He sent them to Paris, Prince of Troy, shepherd on the slopes of Mount Ida, the other Mount Ida, not the Cretan one, and told him to decide. Each goddess offered Paris a bribe. Hera offered power, dominion, kingdoms. Athena offered wisdom, military genius, the ability to be unconquerable in war. Aphrodite offered the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite. This is usually told as a mistake, a young man's predictable foolishness, desire overcoming sense. And in the immediate narrative it is, but there is something else in it, something the myth almost says, that Paris looked at what Hera offered and what Athena offered. Power, wisdom, the capacities that allow you to prevail over others, and found them less compelling than the thing that Aphrodite offered, which was beauty, love, connection, the thing that cannot be achieved through superiority. Whether this makes him foolish or honest is a question the myth leaves open, because the war that followed made the question academic. He took Helen. She was already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta, but Aphrodite had promised, and Paris took what he'd been promised, and the whole human dimension of the war that followed depended on what word you used for that taking: abduction, seduction, elopement. The Greek coalition said one thing, Troy said another. The myths say several, and the several things they say produce a figure who is innocent in some versions and complicit in others, and who suffers regardless. The ships went to Troy, 1,000 of them, or near enough, in the most famous accounting from across the Greek world, a coalition of pride and obligation and reciprocal military service assembled under Agamemnon, who was a complex man in ways that would eventually get him killed in his own bathtub. The war took 10 years, and it was real. There is archaeology under the hill at Hisarlik in what is now Turkey. Real burned levels, real walls, the traces of something that happened, and it also lives entirely in the mythological imagination, which is not the same as the imaginary, which is to say that what it meant has continued to exceed what it was. Athena was on the Greek side. This is related to Paris's choice. She had been offered wisdom and been rejected for desire, and the mythology interprets her alignment with the Greeks as a consequence of that rejection, though it might be more accurate to say she was always going to be on the side of the siege rather than the defended city, always going to be on the side of the sustained strategy rather than the passionate Paris-shaped one. She worked against Troy. She worked with specific Greeks, with Odysseus, consistently, with Diomedes, whom she loved in a particular way. The Iliad gives him a moment where she removes the divine mist from his eyes and lets him see which figures on the battlefield are divine, lets him go after them, and he wounds Ares and Aphrodite in the same battle, which is an astonishing thing for a mortal to do, and which is entirely an Athena gift. She also let the Greeks suffer when they deserved to. When Ajax the Lesser violated Cassandra in her own temple after the city's fall, grabbed the prophetess who had been proven right about everything, who had watched her family die and her city burn, who had survived the war only to encounter this at its conclusion. Athena's rage was specific and devastating. She petitioned Poseidon, who did not typically help her and was not typical about it here either. And between them, they arranged a homecoming for the Greek fleet that included shipwrecks, drownings, delays, and the kind of suffering that does not feel like war's consequence, but like something more deliberate. Ajax was struck by lightning while clinging to a rock in the sea, which might have been satisfying, but probably wasn't enough. And the word probably is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Let me try that again. The rage was enough to shift divine alliances. That's the measure of it. Gods who had reasons not to help her helped her, because some things supersede even that kind of calculation. The war ended. Troy burned. The things that the Greeks had done in the burning, not just Ajax, but the killing of Hector's infant son, the murder of Priam at the altar where he had taken sanctuary, the decision to burn what could have simply been taken. These things carried forward. The homecomings were mostly disasters. Agamemnon made it home and was killed by his wife, who had been waiting, who had reasons. Menelaus made it home eventually, with Helen, and the myths are almost aggressively vague about what that was like. Odysseus's journey, we have told. Many others didn't make it at all. The end of Troy was also the end of the Age of Heroes. That was the last great collective venture, the last time the mythological world organized itself around a single event and sent all its significant figures toward it. After Troy, the scale contracts. The gods pull back. Not completely, not permanently, but toward a different relationship with the mortal world. Less interventionist, more advisory, more present in temples and oracles and the spaces between things than in the direct hand on the shoulder and the voice in the ear. Athena did not pull back completely. She never did. She remained a patron, remained a presence in the temples that went up across the Greek world, remained the goddess of the cities that called themselves hers or that she claimed. But the heroic period, the period of Perseus and Heracles and Bellerophon, and the great expedition to Colchis and the ships before Troy, that was over. And it was over in the specific sense that the instruments of that period, the heroes themselves, were gone, consumed by what they'd done and what had been done to them. What came after was a different kind of mythology, less dramatic, perhaps, more interior. The Greek philosophers, when they came, and they came from the same soil as the myths, which is not a coincidence. They grew out of the same questions the myths had been trying to answer. Found in Athena something they needed. She was already the goddess of wisdom. They made that more specific. They made her the patron of rational thought, of the logos that structures reality, of the philosophical method that proceeds by question and answer toward truth. Socrates was Athenian. He taught in the shadow of the Acropolis. He was, in some readings, doing Athena's work by asking the questions she had always implicitly posed. What is courage? What is justice? What do we actually know? The stories she was embedded in were also the stories that produced tragedy. Aeschylus's Oresteia ends with Athena presiding over the trial of Orestes, who killed his mother to avenge his father, who had been killed by his mother, who was avenging her daughter, who had been killed by his father, a chain of revenge so tightly wound that there is no clean outside to it. Athena constitutes a jury of Athenians. The votes are equal. She casts the deciding vote for acquittal, and in doing so, she institutes, the drama argues, the principle of juridical law over the older, darker principle of blood vengeance. The Furies, who had been pursuing Orestes, who had come screaming out of the founding wound of Uranos's castration and had been pursuing kin violence ever since. She transforms them, receives them, makes them the Eumenides, the kindly ones, gives them honor and temples and a place in the new order. This is one of the most mythologically sophisticated things attributed to her, not the defeat of an enemy, but its transformation. The rage that cannot be appealed to, the principle of infinite consequence. She does not argue it out of existence. She incorporates it, gives it a home within the structure of law, so that law carries the memory of what it replaced. The civilized order she tends is not naive about violence. It contains violence, processed, named, given a formal role. This is why she is the goddess who never lost a war, and why that phrase is more interesting than it sounds. She did not lose wars because she did not fight wars as Ares fought them, as pure contest, as the satisfaction of the aggressive impulse, as the drama of the field. She fought wars as extensions of policy, as tools of an outcome she was already working toward. And the outcome she was working toward was always the same: a world organized enough to sustain the things she valued, which were craft and thought, and the careful making of things that last. Cada, fate. The Greeks called it moira, which means portion, share, the thing allocated. Everyone got a portion. The portions were given at birth by the Moirai, 3 sisters, Clotho, who spun the thread, Lachesis, who measured it, Atropos, who cut it. They were older than the Olympians. They were older than Zeus. They were, in most serious accounts, the ground condition of everything else. Even the gods operated within what the Moirai had set, though the gods had more latitude than mortals in how they moved within it. Athena understood fate better than most gods. The particular quality of her wisdom, Metis, the adaptive intelligence she'd inherited from the mother she'd never known except as the vibration of the belly, she was prepared inside. That quality is specifically suited to operating within constraints. Fate is a constraint. You cannot change the measure of the thread, but you can move within the measure in ways that honor what you are, that make something of the portion given. The heroes she chose understood this too, or learned it. Odysseus did not try to avoid his fate. He tried to navigate it intelligently, to be present enough to the specific moment that the space between prophecy and outcome could be used rather than merely waited through. Perseus did not rage against the prophecy that shadowed his family. He moved through it with the tools given to him and arrived at its fulfillment mostly without, becoming the thing the prophecy had made him fear: death, Thanatos. The Greeks personified everything, which is worth thinking about. When you give something a name and a face, you change your relationship to it. Death with a face is still terrible, but it is a different kind of terrible than death as pure absence. You can negotiate with a face. You can petition it, appease it, understand it as having a nature. The underworld was not, in the Greek imagination, a punishment. Not for everyone, not automatically. It was simply the after. The shades went down to Hades, drank the waters of Lethe if they chose, forgot the weight of the life they'd lived, and waited for what came next, which was depending on what they'd been and done. Judgment, assignment, the specific topography of the underworld claiming them. Elysium for the especially blessed, Tartarus for the spectacularly wicked, the asphodel meadows for everyone else, which is most people, living out a kind of grey middle afterlife that is not suffering but is also not the thing they'd hoped for when they heard about Elysium. Athena sent none of her chosen ones to the underworld casually. She worked to extend their lives when the thread allowed extension. She worked to give them the deaths that the myths call noble, not painless, not early, not easy, but deaths with meaning attached to them, deaths that made sense in the context of what the life had been. Heracles' death is unbearable, but it is his own, and the apotheosis that follows is the mythology's attempt to honor what he was in a way that mere dying couldn't. Memory, Mnemosyne, the mother of the muses, which means the mother of everything the culture is made of. Music, poetry, history, astronomy, comedy, tragedy, all of it came from memory. All of it was the way that the living kept the dead from being fully absent. The way that what mattered about the past was carried forward into a present that would eventually be past itself. Athena was a muse in practice, if not in name. She inspired the craftsmen and the thinkers and the makers who produced the things that survived, the statues, the temples, the poems, the philosophical arguments. The Parthenon was built under her watch, designed for her. And in designing for her, the architects designed a thing that has outlasted everything around it, that persisted through earthquakes and bombardments, and the long attrition of being old that continues to be visited and studied and talked about. Order, cosmos, the arrangement of things in a way that allows them to coexist without consuming each other. This is what Athena tended in the world. Not perfect order, not the stasis of Cronus, but the dynamic order of the city-state, the jury, the treaty, the negotiated compromise that holds things together, while acknowledging that things do not naturally tend toward peace. Left alone, the myths suggest, things tend toward the Titanomachy. Left alone, power eats its children. The order that holds requires active maintenance, requires the kind of attention that is itself a form of wisdom, the kind of attention Athena brought. She is still here, in a sense. Not walking in the temples, those are ruins or repurposed or gone, but as a pattern, an orientation, a way of approaching the world that the mythology crystallized and that the centuries have not dissolved. The owl is still the symbol of wisdom in academic traditions, in university crests, in the iconography of intelligence and learning. The olive branch is still the symbol of peace, the figure of the armed woman who fights not for violence's sake, but for a purposeful outcome. She appears and reappears in the art and literature of every century that has needed her, because every century has needed her. The Romans called her Minerva. They kept her domains largely intact: craft, wisdom, the strategic mind, and added some of their own. She became the patron of the guilds, of the skilled trades, of the people who made things with their hands and their minds together. Roman soldiers prayed to her before campaigns that required more than force. Teachers dedicated their schools to her. The date of her festival, the Kinkatrus, was when schools broke for the season. The academic calendar, in its earliest form, was organized around her. And here is the thing that happens across the centuries of transmission and transformation. The thing that I find most interesting about what Athena becomes in the long conversation humanity keeps having with its own myths. She changes without losing her core. She becomes Christian allegory, wisdom personified in the patristic literature, the rational principle through which the divine word creates. She becomes secular, the figure on seals and coins and institutional logos everywhere, that civilization decided it needed a symbol. She becomes feminist, the armed woman, the virgin sovereign, the goddess who answered to no husband, who had no mother she remembered, who was complete in herself. She becomes pedagogical. She becomes philosophical. She becomes the branding image of institutions that would have horrified the Greeks who first made her. She is also, in all of these later incarnations, a little more comfortable than she was in the original myths. Cleaned up, perhaps. The Arachne story is often left out of the secular iconography. The rage at Ajax is rarely depicted. The complicated question of Medusa, whatever happened there, and the myths refuse to converge on an answer, is usually simplified or discarded. What gets carried forward is the impressive part: the grey eyes, the owl, the spear, the city, the genius. The difficult part is in the original. The difficult part is in the girl who wove too well and was transformed for it, and in the goddess who looked at a perfect tapestry and destroyed it anyway, and in whatever happened in the space between those two acts, in the part the myth doesn't say. Anachronic urperti gelioburaya, a moment where something almost modern surfaces, a goddess defined by intelligence, who nevertheless punishes intelligence when it speaks inconvenient truth. And you can almost hear the specific contemporary note in that, the particular frequency of that kind of conflict, before the myth pulls it back into its own time, its own terms, and the feeling dissipates. The stories don't end. That's the thing about this kind of myth. It doesn't have an ending in the way a novel has an ending, with all the threads gathered, the conflicts resolved, the final image held for a moment before the page. The Greek myths end in dispersal. The gods are still there, or somewhere, or transmuted into something else. The heroes are in the stars, or in the underworld, or in the place where the myths of one culture begin to shade into the myths of another. Athena is still in the stories we tell about being smart in a world that doesn't always reward intelligence. She is in the specific frustration of the person who sees the strategic solution and watches the group choose the emotionally satisfying one. She is in the craftsman who makes something beautiful and finds the market indifferent. She is in the teacher whose students arrive already knowing more than the teacher expected, and the mix of pride and vertigo that produces. She is in the moment when the right choice and the comfortable choice diverge, and someone chooses right. She is in the cities, all the cities, the organized, compromised, difficult, magnificent, exhausting project of living together in sufficient density that you need rules and courts and markets and temples and forums and all the other technologies of coexistence. She didn't promise it would be easy. She gave you the olive tree, which takes decades to mature and cannot be rushed, whose fruit requires pressing and patience and the specific knowledge of how to make what is bitter into what nourishes. The last sentence of Athena's story, if there were one, would not be an ending. It would be a continuation. She is still making. She is still looking. The grey eyes are still open. The thread I started with, the birth, the swallowing, the sickle in the belly of the sky, runs through everything we've covered tonight. It runs through every hero she touched, and every war she shaped, and every city she claimed, and every craft she taught, and every piece of wisdom she transmitted, directly or indirectly, to every mind that has reached for something more precise than force. The thread is long, and it has not been cut. I hope wherever you are, you can feel it. Good night. We'll see you next time.